Banks and NBFCs, the things that matter. To a sustainability professional, that's called materiality, materiality mapping, materiality assessment. But for the ordinary citizen, what are the things that matter in a bank or NBFC and where to look for them? For ordinary citizens, it is this report, this study is fit for use. You can study a company's BRSR report and ask further questions, inquire further, think further, raise issues based on your understanding. For professionals, there's a caution. If you are a sustainability professional, the best that you can use this report for is to use it as a starting point for your own assessments. And if you are into ratings and decision making and business decisions and so on and so forth, this is not the report to be treated as a final. But this report is surely a good starting point for you as a professional. If you are going to work on that, that's a serious business. On the one hand, you should have the PDF of this report with all this listed in front of you. On the other hand, you should have a particular bank's BRSR report. That's the goal of this. Later, we will show you exactly how to assemble all the information that you need to do a further analysis. The first thing that we look at is environmental factors. And this part is going to be relatively quicker in coverage. You can pause the screen and read the content if you need to understand it better. You can also download the PDF version of this document so that you have something for reference for which environmental factor, where should you look. If that's what you require, download the PDF, keep it handy. So air pollution. Air pollution features in principle 6. We already looked at this in our example of how we provide cross-referencing. There is essential indicator 1 on energy and fuel consumption, leading indicator 1 on renewable energy, leading indicator 6 on whether a company has a strategy to reduce energy consumption. The next thing is building emissions. We talked about this. This is unique. This is one of the dimensions in banking. They have large numbers of buildings. In principle 6, essential indicator 1, what are the embodied emissions of owned properties? Owned property, I as a bank should be able to take responsibility for buildings that I own. But as a leading indicator, look at serial number 4, building emissions of properties that you rented. E-waste, principle 6, essential indicator 8, explicitly 8b covers e-waste generated, how much was recovered, how much was disposed, how it was disposed. If you care about social factors, then you care about the working conditions of a company's workforce. Now that's fairly predictable. The list is normal, but banks don't have workers in the category of semi-literate or perhaps illiterate, semi-skilled, unskilled, people who do not know what are their rights, people who might not be able to stand up for themselves. This year are by and large educated, literate, working in a more aware environment. Nevertheless, Section A 418A gives you a sense of how many people that organization has. And if you are comparing one bank to another, the bank with a larger workforce potentially has more working condition issues than a bank with a very small and compact workforce where issues can be easier addressed. But then you want to go to section A723, look at workforce complaints. In essential indicator 2 of principle 3, the retirement benefits provided have to be disclosed. In principle 3, essential indicator 5, does the organization provide parents, whether father or mother, to return after parental leave? Essential indicator 8 asks, Do you provide skill upgradation training? Essential indicator 9 asks how performance reviews are conducted. On salaries and wages, principle 5, essential indicator 3 asks about the variation in salaries between men and women in the workforce and across levels of the organization. From a governance perspective, a very huge variation between top management and the bottom rung of the organization is not considered great, but that's a governance issue. For the same task, a man being paid more than a woman is not also considered great. When you reviewed workforce numbers, you would have looked at the mix of men and women. That proportion of men to women is the salary in the same proportion as men to women. Down here, that's the kind of data you want to look up and assess. Which brings us to equal opportunity, but then also gender diversity, differently abled people, and so on and so forth. So, section 418A and B, when you look at the workforce breakup, what proportion of the workforce is comprised of women, and what proportion do you have differently abled people? Particularly, section 419 gives you data on gender diversity. But when somebody says I have differently abled people, you go to principle 3, look at essential indicator 3. Have they provided accessibility at the place of work to differently abled people? How friendly is the organization to differently abled people? In principle 3, essential indicator 4, are equal opportunities provided to all men, women, differently abled, normal, and so on and so forth. Measures against violence, harassment of employees. This is a very serious issue. Supreme Court has issued Vishaka guidelines by which women that have a complaint of harassment at work have to have a proper method by which their issues are addressed. It merits saying that these issues might not be restricted to women alone. So you're going to look at section 723 and see whether any complaints have been registered. And if you look in principle 5, essential indicator 6 and 7, harassment and discrimination at work, how many complaints, what are the mechanisms to address issues raised by members of the workforce. Go look at principle 5, essential indicator 7. What is the mechanism offered by the organization to protect those who complain of harassment? In principle 5, essential indicator 9 and 10, the organization ought to be independently assessed for its protection of employees from violence and harassment. And based on that external assessment, what remedial action was taken by the organization. Then we move to the employee conditions in subsidiaries and joint ventures. Now we looked at the workforce issues for the bank's own employees. We now need to look at those subsidiaries, those third-party BPOs, external contractors to whom work might have been outsourced by the bank. So look, if you go to section A 521, you can see whether a bank has subsidiaries or joint ventures. And you can also see from workforce how many are contracted employees. Then you come to principle 3, leading indicator. So this is not an essential indicator. Leaders in the business under serial number 5 and 6 will disclose how they have assessed the conditions, all the conditions that we discussed for employees on the own payroll. How are those factors at a contractor's, at a subsidiary, at a joint venture? What are the working conditions, work, pay, health, safety, all those issues in subsidiaries, joint ventures, and contractors? And we know in the top 3 itself, there is at least one bank that has a subsidiary where it outsources all its work. Consumers non-discrimination. Please look at section 3, 16 and 17. Where is the organization present? And then look at essential indicator 3 in principle 9. Are there any complaints? How have they been resolved? Banks in particular are required to engage in responsible marketing practices because it is the savings and the money of people that is involved. And if that gets lost, then the social pressure from that is huge. So please do go look at section 3, 16 and 17, which operations and markets, which operations the bank runs, which markets it serves. Section 723, complaints from customers. Principle 9, business conduct. Essential indicator 2, how do they disclose terms and conditions and product information, product literature to the customers? Principle 9, essential indicator 3, have customers made complaints? Business continuity and disaster recovery is actually classified under Principle 6, which is related to environment. But it's fair to say that for a bank is a critical infrastructure in an economy. And that critical infrastructure needs to be up at all times to serve its customers, to serve the country, to serve the economy. We've classified it under social because it impacts broader society stakeholders significantly. Go look in Principle 6, which actually is environment. Look at leading indicator 7 for what are the business continuity and disaster recovery arrangements at the bank. Now, this is meant as an environmental question. How do you recover from disasters? But please be assured that the Reserve Bank of India expects banks to have BCP, DRP in place. And since BRSR allows cross-referencing, all that the bank has to do is mention in P6 LI7 a cross-reference to where their disclosure for BCP DRP is, possibly in their financial stability report or elsewhere in risk management in their annual report. Corporate social responsibility. Section A6 will tell you whether the company compulsorily has to comply with CSR. Principle 8, leading indicator 2, lists the CSR projects. That's a leading indicator, so it's not essential, but champions would be able to list their CSR projects. Equally, under leading indicator 6, champions would be able to tell you more about who benefited from the CSR and to what extent they benefited from that CSR activity. From a business conduct corporate culture perspective, do look at section 723 to see the nature of complaints. Do look at principle 1, essential indicator 1. Has the bank been fined or penalized for anything? In principle 1, essential indicator 6, conflict of interest of board members and top management has to be disclosed. Look at principle 4. All the essential indicators and lead indicators there relate to stakeholder review. Whom all does the organization consider a stakeholder? Have they consulted them? Have they looked into their interests? We have a separate piece which talks about the breadth and scope of stakeholder review. You should look for that in the description. And that maps all the issues that you, as a person interested in environment, social, business conduct, governance issues at a company, would be interested in, and where to find that in a published BRSR report.